The fluorescent light above the kitchen sink had been flickering for 3 weeks. Daniel Hargrove kept meaning to fix it. He had a spare bulb somewhere in the closet. Behind the box of winter coats Lily had already outgrown and the toolbox with the broken latch. He kept meaning to, but between the warehouse shift that started at 5 in the morning and the delivery route that ended past midnight, meaning to do something had become a luxury he could no longer afford. He stood at the sink now, at 2:13 in the morning, scrubbing the grass stains out of Lily's school uniform by hand, because the coin-operated machine in the basement had eaten his last $1.50, and he couldn't justify another trip to the laundromat until Friday. The water ran cold. He didn't notice anymore. From the narrow hallway, a small voice broke the quiet. "Daddy?" He turned. Lily stood in the doorway in her oversized dinosaur pajamas. The ones that had been her mother's favorite. Claire had bought them 2 sizes up so she'd grow into them. She hadn't quite grown into them yet. Even at 8 years old, she was small for her age. The cardiologist said that was normal, given everything. "Hey, Bug." He kept his voice low, calm. The same voice he used no matter what. "What are you doing up?" "I heard the water." "Sorry. Go back to bed." She padded across the linoleum in her sock feet, the left one sliding a little because the elastic had given out. She stopped at the table and pulled herself up onto a chair, tucking her knees to her chest and watching him the way she always watched him, with eyes that were too knowing for 8 years old. "Daddy, you work too much." "I work the right amount. Mrs. Pellegrino says dads are supposed to sleep at night." Mrs. Pellegrino doesn't have a water bill. That earned a small smile. Small, but real. He lived for those. He wrung out her uniform and draped it over the drying rack he'd rigged from the cabinet handles, a system that Claire would have laughed at and quietly improved. He dried his hands on a dish towel that had once been part of a matched set and now existed alone, fraying at its edges. Everything in this apartment existed alone, fraying at its edges. He sat down across from her. "You need to sleep," he said. "You have school." "I know." She picked at the hem of her pajama sleeve. "Daddy." "Yeah. You don't have to get me anything for my birthday. I don't need a party or presents or cake or anything like that." His chest did the thing it always did when she said something like this. A slow, pulling ache, like a stitch in a muscle that never fully healed. "Where's that coming from?" She shrugged. The gesture was so practiced, so deliberately casual, that it broke his heart completely. She'd learned it from watching him. He recognized it because he'd invented it. "I just know things cost money," she said. "And I know we don't have very much. I'm not sad about it. I just want you to know that I know, so you don't feel bad." He looked at his daughter, this 8-year-old person who was so much her mother's child, who had Claire's eyes, and Claire's stubborn chin, and Claire's habit of taking care of everyone else before herself, and he held the ache inside his chest so it wouldn't reach his face. "Your birthday is important," he said. "I know. But I'm important. Not a cake." He reached across the table and squeezed her hand. Her fingers were cold. He should turn up the heat, except that the gas bill was already 3 months behind. "Go to bed," he said softly. "I'll come tuck you in." She slid off the chair and shuffled back down the hallway. He listened to the sound of her feet, the familiar creak of the 3rd floorboard, the soft click of her bedroom door. Then he sat alone in the flickering light and let himself have 45 seconds of despair. He counted them out. He'd learned to do that to give himself a measured allowance of grief rather than holding it in completely, which made it worse, or letting it run free, which he couldn't afford. 45 seconds. Then he picked up the folder on the table. Hargrove, Lily May. Age 8. Diagnosis: congenital aortic valve stenosis, severe. Recommended intervention: transcatheter aortic valve replacement. Estimated cost: $194,000. Financial assistance applied. Pending. Insurance coverage: partial. Outstanding balance: $187,500. $187,500. He had $412 in his checking account. He had already tried the hospital's financial assistance program, denied, because his 3 jobs technically pushed him above the poverty threshold by a margin that existed only on paper and not in any reality he recognized. He had tried the bank. twice. He had tried a personal loan service online that turned out to be a predatory scam that cost him $40 to find out. He had called his older brother, Kevin, who had been sympathetic and then silent, and then had a reason he had to go. He had called Claire's parents, who had not spoken to him since the funeral, who had answered the phone and gone quiet when he explained, and then told him they were sorry and hung up. He had sat in the office of the cardiologist, Dr. Pemberton, a patient and careful man who had explained the timeline with great gentleness. Without the procedure, the stenosis would worsen. 6 months, maybe 8. There would be symptoms, fatigue, breathlessness, the episode she was already having, where she went pale and still, and her lips turned slightly blue, and Daniel's whole world narrowed to a single point of terror. And then, eventually, worse than that, Daniel had nodded. He had thanked the doctor. He had walked to his truck in the parking garage and sat with his forehead against the steering wheel for a long time. He worked 3 jobs. He sold Claire's jewelry, the pieces her mother had given her, the ones he'd promised himself he would save for Lily. He applied for every grant he could find. He put up a fundraising page online that raised $400 and then went quiet. And then, 3 days ago, he had found a flyer tucked under his windshield wiper in the parking lot of the warehouse. It was printed on bright yellow paper, the kind used for garage sales and lost dog notices. The text was brief, clinical, almost polite in its bluntness. Are you in financial crisis? Healthy donors needed. Compensation: $80,000. $100,000. Confidential. Call to learn more. There was a phone number. Nothing else. Daniel had folded the flyer and put it in his jacket pocket. He had driven home. He had made Lily dinner scrambled eggs, because that was what they had, and helped her with her reading homework, and listened to her tell him about the argument between 2 of her classmates with the seriousness of a diplomat. He had tucked her in and waited until her breathing evened out, and then sat on the edge of her bed in the dark for a long time. Then he had gone to the kitchen table, taken out the flyer, and smoothed the creases flat. He turned it over in his hands. He looked at the folder with Lily's name on it. He looked at the number. He picked up his phone. The address he'd been given was a suite on the 3rd floor of a building that looked, from the outside, like any other commercial building on the edge of the medical district. Beige concrete, a parking lot with cracked asphalt, a dry cleaning shop at street level. The kind of building that existed in every mid-sized American city. Unmemorable by design, Daniel found Suite 312 at the end of a corridor that smelled of carpet cleaner and something underneath it that he didn't examine too closely. The door had no signage. He knocked. The man who answered was perhaps 60. With the careful grooming and practiced neutrality of someone who had learned long ago that warmth was a liability. He introduced himself as Mr. Voss. He shook Daniel's hand and gestured him toward a chair and offered him coffee from a machine in the corner, which Daniel declined. The room was set up to suggest legitimacy: a desk, filing cabinets, a framed certificate on the wall that Daniel could not read from where he sat. The chair was comfortable. The lighting was soft. These were choices, he realized. Everything about this room was a choice designed to make him feel that whatever happened next was reasonable and consensual and fine. Voss talked for 20 minutes. He explained the procedure, the medical screening, the surgical arrangement, the payment structure. He used clean, professional language and answered Daniel's questions with the fluency of someone who had answered them many times before. He slid a single-page document across the desk and let Daniel read it in silence. "What are the risks?" Daniel asked. Voss nodded, as if this were the expected question, and he respected it. Living with a single kidney is entirely compatible with a normal life. Statistically, long-term complications are minimal. That's not what I asked. A slight pause. There are surgical risks, as with any procedure. There is a small possibility of dying, of complications, Voss said, which can, in rare cases, be serious. Daniel looked at the document. He looked at the number at the bottom. $90,000. To be transferred within 72 hours of the procedure. $90,000. He needed 187. That doesn't cover the whole cost, he said. No. But combined with your current savings and financing options, I've tried every financing option. Voss was quiet for a moment. Then, carefully, there are ways to supplement. The organization has relationships with certain lending. How long has this been going on? This arrangement. We've been operating for several years. How many people have he started again? Has anyone died? During one of these procedures, Voss held his gaze. Our record is excellent. It was not the same as no. Daniel understood that. He sat for a long time. He thought about Lily at the kitchen table in the flickering light, tucking her knees to her chest and telling him she didn't need a birthday cake because she understood money. He thought about her in the cardiologist's office, very still and very quiet, while Dr. Pemberton spoke, the way she got when she was scared and didn't want him to know it. He thought about the blue that came to her lips during the episodes. He thought about the folder on his table, and the number at the bottom of it, and the $412 standing between his daughter and the rest of her life. He thought about Claire. About what Claire would say. He didn't let himself think about it for too long, because he knew what she would say. And he also knew that she was not here, and that the only person left was him, and that there was no option he had not already exhausted. He picked up the pen. When? He asked. We can schedule within 10 days. He signed the form. His handwriting was very neat. Claire had always teased him about that, said he wrote like a pharmacist. He pressed the pen hard enough to leave an impression on the page beneath. When he left, he sat in his truck in the parking lot for a long time without starting the engine. The late afternoon sun was very flat and pale, the way it gets in November. And the parking lot looked like something out of a photograph taken to illustrate ordinary sadness. A woman pushed a stroller past the entrance. A kid on a bike rode through the far end without stopping. He thought about telling someone. His brother. A friend. Dr. Pemberton, maybe. Who had been kind, but there was no one who could help. And there was no version of this where telling someone changed the outcome. It would only create a burden for whoever he told. Or worse, it would create opposition, people who loved him trying to stop him, and he couldn't afford to be stopped. He started the engine. That night, after Lily had brushed her teeth and submitted to the elaborate 9-step bedtime routine she'd invented, and that he'd maintained faithfully because it was the same one Claire had started, he lay down beside her in the narrow bed and held her and listened to her breathing and said nothing. She fell asleep in minutes. She always slept easily, which her doctors said was somewhat unusual given her condition, and which Daniel privately believed was because she trusted completely and without reservation that he would not let anything happen to her. He did not sleep. He stared at the ceiling and counted the shadows from the streetlight through the blinds, and made himself a promise that he would do this thing and survive it, and never tell her, not ever, that the first 8 years of her life had cost him more than she would ever know. Dr. Eleanor Briggs had, at 37, already done more than most surgeons accomplish in a full career. Her curriculum vitae was the kind that made hospital administrators go slightly reverent when they read it. The cardiothoracic fellowship at Johns Hopkins, the research publications, the techniques she'd pioneered in minimally invasive valve replacement that had since become standard practice in teaching hospitals across the country. She had been recruited to Mercy General 3 years ago with a compensation package that would have embarrassed her to describe out loud, and she had accepted it primarily because the hospital had agreed, as a condition of her contract, to fund a charitable surgical program that provided procedures at no cost to qualifying low-income patients. She was not, by conventional measure, a warm person. She knew this about herself, the way one knows about a structural feature of a house, not with shame, but with the pragmatic awareness that it has implications. She was precise. She was demanding. In the OR, she was something close to terrifying, in the way that true excellence sometimes is. The residents who trained under her were exhausted and grateful in equal measure. Outside the OR, she was private in a way that occasionally read as coldness and was sometimes simply shyness. She had no patience for social performance and considerable patience for complicated problems. She had 2 close friends, a habit of reading dense history books on Sunday mornings, and a standard poodle named Harold, who held the distinction of being the only creature on Earth toward whom she was unconditionally soft. She had never married. She had come close once, years ago, a fellow surgeon named Patrick, who was brilliant and kind and ultimately could not reconcile himself to the reality of a life shared with someone whose first loyalty would always be to the operating room. She did not blame him for this. She understood it entirely, and the ending had been quiet and mutual and sad in the way that adult endings often are. Carrying grief without drama. What she carried instead, and had carried since the age of 11, was the particular grief of watching someone die for want of money. Her father, Robert Briggs, had been a high school history teacher in western Pennsylvania. He had developed coronary artery disease in his mid-50s, the kind that was entirely treatable with a relatively straightforward bypass procedure. He had private insurance through the school district. But the coverage had gaps. Gaps that Eleanor, at 11, had not known to question, and that her mother, at 43, had not known how to navigate, and the procedure was delayed while appeals were filed and forms were resubmitted, and weeks passed. He died of a cardiac event 11 days before the surgery was approved. Eleanor did not talk about this. It was not a story she told, but it was the reason she had gone to medical school. The reason she had specialized in cardiothoracic surgery, and the reason she had built a charitable program into the terms of her employment contract. It was, in some sense, the organizing fact of her life. She arrived at the hospital on the Tuesday morning of Daniel's scheduled procedure with a full surgical slate, 2 valve repairs, and an aortic aneurysm repair in the mild but contained alertness she always felt on heavy OR days, like a runner settling into pace. She moved through the morning efficiently. The first 2 procedures went cleanly. She ate lunch at her desk, reviewed charts, answered emails with the economy of someone who had long since stopped apologizing for brevity. At 2:30, her resident, Dr. Marcus Webb, appeared in her office doorway with the slightly careful expression of someone delivering information they weren't certain how to characterize. Dr. Briggs. There's a consent form flag on a case in OR 4. The patient it's listed as a voluntary donor nephrectomy, but the referring documentation is irregular. She looked up from her chart. Irregular how? The originating facility isn't a registered transplant center, and the recipient designation is blank. Eleanor set down her pen. In legitimate living donor transplant programs, the recipient designation is never blank. It was one of the most basic elements of the documentation. The entire ethical and legal framework of the procedure depended on it. Who's the patient? Daniel Hargrove, 38 years old. No significant medical history. Who cleared the procedure? Webb's expression tightened slightly. Dr. Okafor. I know who he is. She stood, pulled the full file. She read the file standing at the nurse's station, which she sometimes did when she was in a hurry, and sometimes did when she was too agitated to sit. Daniel Hargrove, 38, laborer, 3 years of employment records attached, showing income across multiple positions that added up to something that should have been enough and wasn't, because of what the file documented next. The invoices from Mercy General's own cardiology department. The insurance correspondence. The denial letters. The financial assistance application and its rejection. The fundraising page, Still Live, with its $400 total. And the diagnosis. Lily Hargrove, age 8. Congenital aortic valve stenosis. Severe. Pending TAVR procedure. Eleanor read this twice. She set the file down. She picked it up again. She was not someone who cried easily. She had watched people die on her table, and had felt the grief of it as something cold and still, like a stone laid in her chest, which she carried, but did not allow to move her until she was alone. She had learned this containment deliberately, over years of training, because a surgeon who cries during a procedure is a surgeon who makes mistakes. But standing at the nurse's station, reading the financial records of a man who had signed away his kidney to save his daughter's life because every other option had been exhausted, she felt something in her chest move in a way that was not entirely containable. She closed the file. "Find out which room Mr. Hargrove is in," she told Webb. "Don't tell him why. He had already been prepped." She found him in a pre-op bay, lying on the gurney in the thin cotton gown, staring at the ceiling with the particular stillness of someone who has made a decision they cannot unmake and is no longer questioning it. His hands were folded on his stomach. He was not, she noted, the kind of man who would be described as visibly distressed in this moment. But the quality of his stillness was the quality of someone who has exhausted himself. There was a photograph, face down, folded in the grip of his left hand. She introduced herself. He looked at her with mild surprise. Surgeons didn't usually come to pre-op bays to introduce themselves to patients who were not their patients. "I'm not here about your procedure," she said. She kept her voice neutral. "I've been reviewing your file." A pause. "Why?" "There were some irregularities in the documentation that came to my attention." She paused. "I wanted to ask you directly about your situation." He was quiet for a moment. Then, carefully, "What do you want to know? Tell me about your daughter." He looked at her. She watched him make the calculation. Why is this person asking? What does she want? Can I trust her? And she held his gaze steadily and said nothing. He told her. It took 11 minutes. He was not an elaborate speaker. He laid out the facts with the stripped-down efficiency of someone who had been over them many times and had no energy left for ornamentation. The diagnosis, the cost, the applications and rejections, the jobs, the flyer. He told it without self-pity, which was somehow worse than if he'd had some. When he finished, she asked, "Does your daughter know?" "No." "Does anyone know you're here today?" "No." She looked down at the photograph in his hand without asking about it. She didn't need to. She had spent 2 hours that afternoon, between the end of her second procedure and this moment, making phone calls. She had spoken to an investigator she knew in the state medical board's office. She had spoken to the head of transplant services at University Hospital across the city. She had spoken to her own hospital's legal counsel. And she had spoken, briefly, to Mercy General's charitable care program coordinator, a woman named Denise, who had worked there for 20 years and knew every financial pathway that existed within the system. Now she looked at Daniel Hargrove in his pre-op bay and said, "I need you to listen to me very carefully." She walked into OR 4 without announcement, which was her prerogative as chief of cardiothoracic surgery, in a way that no one had ever successfully challenged. The room was prepped. The surgical team was in position. Daniel had been brought in and was being administered the preliminary sedative. Voss was present, standing against the far wall in a visitor's scrub suit, with the practiced ease of someone who had arranged this kind of thing before and expected it to proceed without interruption. Eleanor surveyed the room once. "Stop," she said. The anesthesiologist, a young resident named Griffin, looked up with startled eyes. The scrub technician froze. Voss straightened. "Dr. Briggs, this procedure has been cleared by a physician who I will be reporting to the medical board within the hour." Her voice was extremely calm. "The originating facility is not a licensed transplant center. The recipient designation is absent from all documentation. This procedure constitutes illegal organ trafficking under federal law." "Silence." "The patient has consented," Voss began. "The patient consented under financial duress, without full disclosure of the legal framework governing live donation in this state." She turned to Griffin. "Halt the sedative administration." Griffin halted it. Voss took a step forward. His calm was beginning to show its seams. "Dr. Briggs, I want to be very clear about, I want you to leave this room," she said. "If you are still in this room in 30 seconds, I will call hospital security, and we will wait together for the police to arrive. Those are your options." He was gone in 20. The room let out a collective breath. Eleanor moved to the gurney where Daniel lay partially sedated now. His eyes heavy but open, looking at her with an expression she couldn't fully read. "What's happening?" he said. His voice was thick. "The procedure is stopped," she said. "You're safe. My daughter is going to be okay." She said it before she had fully worked out how she was going to make it true, which was not her usual practice. "I need you to trust me." His eyes went bright. The kind of bright that happens just before a person cries. He turned his face away, toward the ceiling, and she watched the movement in his jaw, the effortful clench of a man who has been not crying for a very long time and is reaching the limit of the practice. "No one has told me that in a long time," he said. The words were quiet and unsteady. "No one has told me she's going to be okay." Eleanor stood next to the gurney and said nothing and let him have it. After a moment, she put her hand briefly on his arm, not the gesture of a doctor checking a patient's condition, just the gesture of a person acknowledging another person's pain, and then she stepped back and began the series of phone calls that would change the next several months of both their lives. He didn't believe her at first. This was understandable. Eleanor understood it the way she understood most things analytically, with genuine respect for the reasoning that produced it. A man who has been failed by every institution he'd appealed to, who had arrived at the decision to sell a piece of himself as the rational conclusion of an exhaustive process, was not a man disposed to accept miraculous reversals on faith. They sat in a small consultation room off the pre-op corridor. He was still in the hospital gown, a blanket around his shoulders, his color returning as the partial sedative wore off. He held a cup of coffee that someone had brought him and hadn't drunk. She told him clearly she intended to cover the cost of Lily's procedure herself through her charitable trust. She intended to arrange for Lily's care at Mercy General, under her own surgical supervision, at no cost to him. He looked at her for a long time. "Why?" he said. It was the right question. She appreciated it. "Because I can," she said. "And because there is no version of a just world in which what you were about to do this afternoon is the only option available to you. I don't want charity. I know. What you want is your daughter to be alive. That's what this is for." He looked at the floor. "People don't just this doesn't happen. People don't just do this." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "My father died when I was 11. Cardiac event. It was preventable. The procedure he needed was straightforward. The delay was a paperwork failure, and he was dead 11 days before the surgery date." She said it without particular emotion, the way she always said it when she chose to say it. "Every case I take, every procedure I do, is partly for him. I'm not telling you this to make you feel obligated. I'm telling you so you understand that this is not impulse or pity. This is what I built my career to do." The silence between them was a different quality of silence. He looked up. His eyes were red at the rims. "She's 8, he said. "I know. She told me last week she didn't need a birthday cake because she knew money was tight." His voice cracked on the last word. He stopped, cleared his throat. "She's 8 years old and she's trying to take care of me. I'm supposed to be taking care of her." "You are," Eleanor said. "You have been, every day of her life, by every measure that counts." He pressed his hand over his eyes. She let him. When he finally lifted his face, he looked at her with the directness of someone who has decided to lay down whatever armor they've been carrying. "Okay," he said. "Okay." She was small. Eleanor had reviewed the case extensively before the introductory meeting and had formed, from the records and imaging, a clear clinical picture of Lily Hargrove, but nothing in the records had prepared her for the actual child, who sat up very straight in the hospital bed with an expression of determined dignity that was both 8 years old and ancient. Lily had her father's dark eyes. She had her mother's chin. Eleanor had seen a photograph by now, Claire Hargrove, at a family gathering years ago, a woman with a bright and stubborn face. The dignity was all her own. She looked at Eleanor for a moment after the introduction. "Are you the doctor who's going to fix my heart?" she asked. "Yes," Eleanor said. "Are you good?" "I'm very good." Lily considered this. "Daddy says you're the best doctor in the hospital. He's being generous." "He doesn't lie," Lily said matter-of-factly. "He doesn't like it. He says it makes everything more complicated." Eleanor glanced at Daniel, who was standing in the corner of the room, with his arms folded and his expression carefully arranged, which she had come to recognize as his version of trying not to show how much something was affecting him. "Your daddy is right," she said. "About both things." Lily nodded, apparently satisfied. Then, "Are you going to have to cut me open? The incision is very small. You won't even see it properly once it heals." Does it hurt? You'll be asleep for all of it. When you wake up, it'll be done. And then will my heart work right? Yes. Lily looked at her father. Something passed between them, the particular wordless communication of two people who have spent years being each other's only person. Okay, Lily said. I believe you. She held out her hand, as if confirming a deal. Eleanor shook it. The child's hand was very small and very cool in hers. She looked up and caught Daniel's face in the instant before he turned away. And she understood completely the motion she saw in it, the terrible, crushing relief of a man who has been carrying something enormous and is only now beginning, cautiously, to put it down. The procedure was scheduled for 7 days after Daniel's aborted appointment with Voss. Eleanor spent those 7 days as she always spent the days before a technically demanding case, reviewing imaging, consulting with colleagues, running through the procedural steps in the systematic mental rehearsal that she had practiced since her residency. The aortic valve stenosis in Lily's case was severe but surgically well defined. The anatomy was clear on imaging. The approach she'd selected was the least invasive available and carried, in her hands, a complication rate she considered acceptable. She did not tell Daniel what acceptable meant in absolute terms. She told him it was her assessment that the surgical risk was manageable and that her recommendation was to proceed. He nodded and asked 2 technical questions that surprised her. He'd clearly been reading, preparing, trying to understand what was going to happen to his daughter. She answered both questions fully. She did not simplify. The morning of the surgery, Daniel arrived with Lily at 6:15. Lily was wearing her own clothes, a yellow sweater over a striped shirt, because she had asked if she could wear her own clothes until she needed to change into the hospital gown, and this request had been accommodated. She was carrying a small stuffed rabbit named Garrison, who had one eye and a repaired ear, and the particular well-loved texture of something that has been carried everywhere for years. Eleanor was in the scrub room when Daniel came to find her. Just before Lily was wheeled to pre-op, he stood in the doorway. He didn't say anything for a moment. If something happens, he started. It won't. If something happens, he said again, firmly. I want you to know that I'm grateful. For all of it. Whatever happens, she looked at him. Nothing is going to happen. I have done this procedure 240 times. I am going to go in there, and I am going to fix your daughter's heart, and I am going to come out and tell you that she's asking for you. That is exactly what is going to happen. He held her gaze. Then he nodded. Okay, he said. Okay. The procedure began at 7:42. Eleanor worked with the focused, almost meditative attention that surgery required, the world contracting to the dimensions of the operative field, to the valve anatomy and the instruments, and the quiet, rhythmic communication of her team. Petra Caswell, her second, worked on her left. Scrub technician Roland Jeffries, who had worked with her for 6 years and could anticipate her instrument requests before she made them, worked across from her. Anesthesiologist Dr. Yuen monitored Lily's vitals with steady efficiency. At 9:23, there was a complication. Not unexpected, it was a known risk of the procedure, a transient arrhythmia during valve deployment, but in Lily's case it was prolonged, and for 16 seconds the monitors showed a cardiac rhythm that was wrong in ways Eleanor recognized as urgent. The room tightened. She's going to come back, Eleanor said. She said it with the same certainty she used when she was certain. She said it with the same certainty she used when she needed certainty to exist so badly that it had to be spoken into the room to be real. Dr. Caswell made an adjustment. Roland had the defibrillator paddles ready. At second 17, the rhythm normalized. The room exhaled. Eleanor completed the procedure in silence. Her hands did not shake. They never shook. She had spent years ensuring they never shook, because the girl on the table needed them not to. She closed at 12:11. Lily Hargrove's new aortic valve was in position and functioning. Her heart was beating correctly, with the regular and adequate strength that it had never had in 8 years of life. Eleanor stood for a moment, still gloved and gowned, looking at the clean lines of the closed incision. She thought about her father. She thought about the form letter her mother had received 11 days before his surgery was approved. She thought about the choices she had made at 11 years old, sitting on the stairs of their house listening to her mother cry, that had led her here to this room, to these hands, to this child's restored heart. Then she pulled off her gloves and went to find the father. The hospital corridor outside the surgical waiting area smelled of floor wax and the particular anxiety that soaks into institutional spaces over time. Daniel had been there for 4 hours and 23 minutes. Eleanor knew this because the waiting area had a clock, and she had looked at it on her way down. He was standing when she came through the door. He had been standing or pacing for most of the 4 hours, according to the floor staff unable to sit. Too controlled to do anything more dramatic than that. He saw her face before she said anything. He sat down. She sat across from him and said, "She's out of surgery. She's in recovery. Everything went extremely well." The sound he made was not a word. It was the sound of someone who has been holding themselves together by force of will across a very long period of time and has just been given, at last, permission to let go. He covered his face with his hands. His shoulders shook. Eleanor sat with him. She did not look away, and she did not pretend not to see it, and she did not rush toward consoling platitudes. She simply sat with him in the way she had learned, in the long years of her career, was sometimes the only thing needed, the simple presence of another person willing to be fully in the room. After a while, he lowered his hands. His face was wet. He didn't appear to care. "Can I see her? Recovery will bring you back in about 20 minutes. She's still coming out of the anesthetic." Eleanor paused. "She'll probably ask for you as soon as she's coherent." "How do you know?" "Because she asked for you in pre-op. And in my experience, people who ask for someone when they're scared are people who ask for them again when they're safe." She stood. "Garrison is in a bag with her personal items. They'll bring him through." He almost smiled at the rabbit's name. "Almost. Dr. Briggs." He said it with a quality of weight. She recognized someone who wants to say something and doesn't have the language for it. "You don't need to say anything," she told him. "I know. I want to." She waited. He stopped. "The past 3 years, since Claire died, he stopped again, tried a different approach. I haven't been sure there was any that it was going to. I've been operating on pure survival mode, just getting through each day because the next day was Lily's day. Not because I had any." He stopped. She understood him completely. "There's no obligation to be okay," she said. "There never was. But you're allowed to be, now. You're allowed to start." He looked at her, held her gaze with the steadiness of someone who has very little left to lose, and therefore nothing to perform. "Thank you," he said. "Not just for today." She nodded. And then, because it was true, and because she thought he needed to hear it, "You didn't break. You had every reason to, and you didn't." She left him there and went back to her office and sat at her desk for a while, without doing anything in particular. Harold was at home. Sunday was 2 days away. She thought, distantly, that she would take him to the park, where there was a long trail through the woods that she liked for its almost complete absence of human noise. She thought about her father, which she did not always do consciously, but which she found, on days like this, happened on its own. She thought about him in the specific and detailed way she could still manage after 26 years, the particular quality of his laugh, the smell of the history books stacked on his nightstand, the way he had called her Ellie when he was very pleased with her, and Eleanor when he was very serious. She thought about what he would have made of today. She thought he would have approved. She thought about Daniel Hargrove sitting in that corridor with his face in his hands, and about Lily asking if she was good, and about the 16 seconds of arrhythmia during the procedure when she had said, with complete conviction, "She's going to come back," and had meant it with everything she had. She thought about the flicker of certainty that had passed through her in that moment. Not confidence, exactly, which was a thing you cultivated and maintained. Something older and quieter, something that felt like being, briefly, exactly where you were supposed to be. She stayed at the desk until the feeling in her chest had settled into something she could work with. And then she opened her laptop and began drafting the paperwork. In the months that followed, Eleanor did not tell anyone what she had done. She had not arranged any of it for recognition. She had arranged it the way she arranged most things, because a problem existed that was within her capacity to solve, and the solving of it was simply the correct action. The charitable trust covered Lily's procedure and the subsequent care. Eleanor made a call to the director of a foundation that offered housing assistance to families of pediatric cardiac patients, and within 3 weeks Daniel and Lily were in a 2-bedroom apartment in a decent building with a working elevator and a landlord who responded to maintenance requests. She did not tell Daniel she had made this call. She told him only that the foundation had a program and gave him the number, which he called himself. He found work. A maintenance company took him on full-time at a salary that, combined with the reduction in medical debt, left him for the first time in years with money he did not immediately need to allocate to a crisis. He kept only 2 jobs for a while. Old habits. And then, slowly, one. He fixed the flickering light in his kitchen. Lily recovered with the uncomplicated physiological resilience of childhood. Her color improved within days. Her energy returned in stages, first cautious, then tentative, then, 6 weeks post-surgery, entirely herself again, loud and curious, and in constant negotiation with gravity, in the way of children who have been told to be careful for too long and are now making up for lost time. She started taking herself seriously as an artist. It had begun in the hospital, during her recovery, when Eleanor had brought her a sketch pad and a set of colored pencils, a practical choice. She had told Lily, because drawing was quiet and didn't require moving around much, which was true, and also a slight cover for the fact that she had simply wanted to bring her something. Lily had drawn continuously for 2 weeks, filling the pad with images that ranged from careful representational drawings, Garrison the rabbit, a portrait of her father, that Eleanor found surprisingly good for an 8-year-old, to elaborately invented scenes that populated the margins of every page. On the morning before her discharge, she presented Eleanor with the last drawing in the pad. It was a woman in a white coat, rendered in confident strokes of blue and white. The figure had no particular resemblance to Eleanor, the proportions were childlike. The face stylized, but she had been given a pair of large white wings extending from her shoulders, and she stood with both arms raised, and around her, in a wide arc, were drawn smaller figures. And the figures were all different. And they were all standing up. Lily handed it to her without ceremony. "That's you," she said. "The wings are because you make sick people better. And those are all the people whose hearts you fixed." She pointed to the smaller figures. "I put Daddy in there too. His heart was broken too." In the other way, Eleanor looked at the drawing. She looked at it for long enough that Lily's expression shifted slightly, the confidence of the gift-giver going uncertain, wondering if she'd gotten it wrong. "Do you like it?" Lily asked. "I love it," Eleanor said. Her voice was steady. "Mostly. You can keep it," Lily said. "I made it for you." Eleanor folded it carefully and put it in the breast pocket of her coat, against her chest. She wore the coat for the rest of that day without taking it out, aware of it there, the small weight of it, the soft edges of the paper against the fabric. 3 months after Lily's discharge. On a Saturday afternoon in late February, Eleanor was walking Harold along the trail in the park when she encountered Daniel and Lily coming from the opposite direction. This was apparently not rare. Daniel mentioned they'd started walking the trail most weekends since it was close to their new apartment. He seemed slightly surprised to see her. Harold was not surprised to see Lily, because Harold was not a dog who experienced surprise. He simply turned his large, intelligent face toward her and permitted himself to be petted with great thoroughness while making deep sounds of satisfaction. "He's very handsome," Lily said seriously. "He knows," Eleanor said. "Can I walk him?" Eleanor handed over the leash. Lily took it with both hands and proceeded up the trail with the gravity of someone entrusted with significant responsibility. Harold matched her pace with the dignity of a poodle who has learned, over years, to modulate himself. Daniel and Eleanor walked a few steps behind. It was a gray February day, the kind with a low white sky and bare trees, and the sense of something held in suspension, waiting. The woods were quiet, except for the far-off sound of birds, and Lily's running commentary to Harold on the topics of mud, interesting sticks, and the correct way to navigate puddles. "She seems happy," Eleanor said. "She is." He watched his daughter ahead of them. She told her class she's going to be a doctor. A heart doctor, specifically. She'd be a good one. She'd argue with all her professors. That's how you know she'd be a good one. He laughed. It was a good sound. Uncomplicated. Real. She hadn't heard him laugh before. She filed it away. They walked in comfortable silence for a while. "How are you?" she asked. He considered the question with the seriousness he applied to most questions. "Better," he said. "Actually better. Not just I actually sleep now. That's new. Sleep is useful. I started sleeping in my own bed again. I'd been sleeping in the chair in Lily's room for, I don't know, 2 years. She doesn't need me to. But I don't know. You were afraid to stop watching." "Yeah," he paused. "I'm still working on that. But I sleep in my own bed now." "That's a start." She looked at him. He looked back at her without evasion. Ahead of them, Lily had stopped to show Harold a particularly impressive stick. Harold examined it with appropriate gravity. She turned back to call to them. "Daddy! Dr. Briggs! Look!" They looked. The stick was, by any fair measure, a very good stick. "Excellent stick," Eleanor called. Lily beamed. She turned back to Harold, apparently satisfied, and began explaining to him the stick's superior qualities in considerable detail. Harold listened with the patient, unblinking attention of a dog who understood that being listened to was one of the most important things you could give a person or a child, and that the distinction did not always matter. Daniel smiled. The particular smile of a father watching his daughter be herself ordinary and alive and entirely fine. Eleanor felt the thing in her chest that she had been aware of for some months now settle into a different arrangement. Not a resolution. Not an arrival. More like a door she had not known was closed, standing quietly open, not demanding anything, simply open, with light coming through it from the other side. "I'm glad she found that stick," Eleanor said. "She finds everything," Daniel said. "That's just how she is." They walked on, the four of them, in the gray and quiet February woods. The day was ordinary. The day was complete. The day was, in every way that mattered, enough. Above them, through the bare branches, the sky was already beginning to lighten that particular pale luminosity that arrives before snow or before spring, and is sometimes, if you are paying close enough attention, and if you have earned the right to notice it through enough long nights and hard mornings, almost impossible to distinguish from hope.